Listen, maybe one day we'll capture a fighting machine, eh?
So, The Massacre of Mankind. I've begun reviewing the book today. We're starting with Book 1. As I say, this book itself is split into 4 books, which are like main chapters with mini chapters as sub-chapters underneath them. So, Book 1, The Return of the Martians. Chapter 1, A Call to Arms. So the book starts talking about the space of this fictional world being our solar system, and that the further out from the sun a planet is, the colder it is, and the older the civilization that might be living on it. And they're saying the Jovians, as in creatures that might live on Jupiter, were watching the first Martian War, which is what they're terming the war that happened in the War of the Worlds original book. This is a short chapter. The female, who is the new narrator, who is like reading all this as her past memoir, is now saying that the War of the Worlds, like diegetically within the story, is the account penned by Walter Jenkins, who is that's the new name for the old journalist of the first book, is in the story known as the narrative, or the narratives of the Martian Wars, and that she did indeed marry and divorce his brother. So they're kind of related now, I suppose. Chapter 2, A Meeting of Veterans. So they're saying this book is set beginning in March 1920. So they're saying that the first Martian invasion was set in 07, they're saying, which is 1907, and that it's now 1920. So already, you know, you're seeing the date disparity with the original War of the Worlds. It should be 1898 when the first invasion happened. They've moved the entire thing to the future so that they can overlap with, like, they're creating an alternate reality World War I, basically, where everything's shaped differently because of the Martian invasion happening first. But they've moved everything forward in time, so the old book they've taken out of where it's meant to be and moved it into the future, and they're saying it happened in the future of where it is by about 10 years, which is fucking annoying for me. That shouldn't be there. You're introduced to, they haven't phrased it, but this is Elphinstone, and she has a journalist colleague who's an American guy, suspicious of Europeans, called Harry Kane, and they're meeting a English general guy, or major, called Eric Eden in New York, and apparently this Eric Eden guy in the first Martian War got captured by the Martians and was inside a working cylinder, seeing what was happening on the inside at the time. So it seems that why they're in New York on a snowy day to meet Major Eric Eden is that Eden knows the journalist, who's called Walter Jenkins in this book, and the journalist is trying to get messages to Miss Elphinstone, because she used to be married to his brother via the Major, because after she divorced his brother, they were like a family split up, so they kind of went their separate ways. So he was reluctant to get involved with her again, but he had to send her a message because he considers her family. It seems that Walter's trying to get in contact with Miss Elphinstone so that he can contact his own wife, who they've made him break up with his own wife. In the first book, the journalist's wife isn't named, I don't think, that she's just his wife. In the musical version, we all know his wife as Carrie, which I hope they name her Carrie in this book. I can't remember if they do. But it's horrible that they've made him break up with his wife. I don't like that decision. They seem really in love in the first book and in the musical. I hate the fact that they've made him divorce his wife in this book. There's a really snarky line in this where they say, like where Miss Elphinstone says of the journalist, "The man's in the dictionary under unreliable narrator," which I think that's horrible and snarky, and I can see what they're trying to do there, trying to give Baxter leeway to kind of make up shit in his sequel that never happened in the first book and make it seem like, you know, with revisionism that it did happen. And he's already done that with the dates, which is why this is not a true sequel to War of the Worlds. But it's the best we'll get. Well, for now anyway. And there are actually quite a lot of people who did sequels to War of the Worlds. A lot of fans of the original who are authors wrote their own sequels to War of the Worlds. So there are a lot of book number 2 out there. They are mentioning that like Major Eden's calling himself and the journalist veterans, and he mentions Bert Cook, which I think he's I think this book is calling the artilleryman Bert Cook, and I think that name partially applies to some of the actors who may have played him, like in the musical, and another name. So it's a reference to another past version of War of the Worlds. And so Major Eden and Bert Cook, the artilleryman, are doing a kind of book tour. They've all written memoirs, I think, of their version of events seeing the First Martian War. And it kind of breaks the fourth wall a few times here. It's kind of annoying, where he's like, yes, the journalist mentions me in Book 1, Chapter 8. As if his memoirs not only exist in our world, in the real world, as the book War of the Worlds, but in their world as the narrative of the First Martian War. Like it's the same book in the fiction that the fiction refers to as it is in the real world. And also he's like, the journalist sold his rights to make movies of his book. So there's like movies of War of the Worlds within the fiction as well. So it keeps breaking the fourth wall, which I find quite annoying. But yeah, Bert Cook I think is the artilleryman, so he and Eden are in New York, like doing a book tour or something, signing copies of their memoirs. And the journalist wants to phone Mrs. Elphinstone via Europe on a submarine cable that goes under the Atlantic, which I assume is a new technology in this. It's important to realise whenever you read War of the Worlds or sequels or whatever, it's steampunk, right? It's Victorian alternate universe type stuff. So there will be tons of technologies that exist in these books. It's kind of like the Golden Compass or something like that. His Dark Materials, that sort of thing. Or, you know, you might have like steampunk blimps and stuff, like the War in the Air and all that. It's alternate universe technology kind of stuff everywhere. I've noticed several times in this that when they're describing the planets, like Earth, Mars, Venus, they don't capitalise the E in Earth. I'm wondering if that's purposeful, that he's doing that. They're trying to demote the validity or authority of Earth, or like trying to make it seem like it shouldn't be an important planet by not capitalising it whenever they say it, which is a social justice thing, by the way, like the B in black and the W in white. Like the communists do this a lot, and Stephen Baxter is slightly a social justice warrior. If you read some of his old books, he does try and inject a few bullshit feminism things into his books, and like making the female a main character in this, I have no problem with it, but he does it in tons of his books and tons of his sequels. He has like all the like I think it was Sunstorm, was it the second Time Odyssey book? It's like all the prime ministers, all the figureheads of state or something, they're all women now, like all of them. And it's just like, yeah, this is tiresome, I know what you're trying to do, stop doing it. I reckon that's what the Earth thing might be here, with not capitalising the E in Earth. It might be one of those. So I will point them out if I see them, because they are bullshit. Baxter does a bit of like damage control, sort of trying to explain why one of the reasons why he's tried to set the previous book's events away from 1898 to 1907, where he's talking about the astronomy of it all, when Mars makes its closest approach. And I don't know if this is accurate. I'm assuming, because he does hard sci-fi with Arthur C. Clarke, that it's accurate that the oppositions, when Earth and Mars are at their closest point, because they, like, Earth has an orbit and then Mars is the next one along, it has an orbit, and the closer planet overtakes the Sun because the closer planets move faster around the Sun than the outer planets. So there are certain times when they're spinning around these donut-shaped, tracks in space, and the times when they pass close to each other, he's saying that there's one in 1894, which is 4 years before when the last book's meant to be set, and then there's a opposition between Mars and Earth in 1909, and an opposition between Mars and Earth in 1924, which is 4 years after this book begins, which I think is when they're going to say that the next attack is launched. So he's trying to say he's fictional revisionized the dates of the last book due to finding out the astronomy of Mars-Earth oppositions. So I can kind of understand that in a way, but that's not when War of the Worlds is set. You are fictionally history revisionizing, and I don't agree with that, even if you explain it like that. Because in the end, it's a fictional universe. You can do what you want. You can say that in this universe, the oppositions between Mars and Earth are different from in the real universe. The fictional universe and real life are different because one's a fiction, so you can do what you want. But he's trying to insert realism and stuff, which interferes with the events set out in the previous fiction, which is a fiction. So that's annoying. There's a line in here that the public were doing false alarms. So there's like a, "Oi mate, you got a licence for that telescope?" kind of line in here. Like they said, it's a criminal offence now to have an unlicensed telescope. Okay. "Oi mate, you got a licence for those eyeballs? You were talking about stuff that you saw wrong." On to Chapter 3, An Artilleryman in New York. So Bert Cook is the artilleryman in this. So they go to the Plaza, which is a hotel. Harry Kane, Miss Elphinstone, and Major Eric Eden. And Eric Eden has the flatmate of the artilleryman in this hotel. He's got this room buddy, because they're doing their tour, and he's sitting in the hotel there, and he's got Memoirs of an Artilleryman on the side, which is his book that he's trying to sell. Now, I've always loved the artilleryman. He's a great character. His politics aren't the same as mine, but he's a great character. He's all about meritocracy. So if you think of some fool like Sargon of Akkad, that's the sort of politics that the artilleryman has, all about meritocracy. The weak fall by the wayside, but the strong will be saved. Brave New World. That's the kind of guy he is. But he's the secondary character of War of the Worlds, and he's the one who comes up with the plan to fight the Martians, but the journalist decides that he's a bit too lazy to fulfill his plan, and that he's just playing games, so he just he's working with him to dig the underground civilization for a moment there, and then he goes, "I feel a traitor to my kind," and he just leaves him in London to do his own thing, and they part ways. So there's probably some bitterness here between them, because they parted ways and he stopped helping him dig the underground caverns and cave bases that were to defeat the Martians, and just kind of went off into the wilderness to find a different way to survive. And they both saw the end of the Martian War separately, I guess. But also there's another part of Bert Cook, the artilleryman. There's another part of his personality that's like fuck society. Like, it's all the things we see in the street are wrong. Like, it's built in the wrong way. Let's kind of start again from scratch, sort of thing. I don't know if it might not be anarchistic in that way. He might be envisioning. I think he is. He's envisioning his own kind of new government. So yeah, scratch that. I don't think he's an anarchist, but the way he kind of looks around him and he's like, we could do this better, sort of thing. The world around me. I mean, a lot of people like me kind of feel this way. The world around us is set out wrong, and we could definitely do it better. He's got that kind of flair about him. But also he's like a practical man who practically wants to think of ways to fight the Martians, like, all the time. And I love what they've actually done with him in this book. I love he kind of infiltrates the Martians, and because one thing about the Martians is they kind of take humans not only as food but as kind of pets and things to experiment on. To, like, the artilleryman predicts right that they'd be like captured as pets and made to do tricks by the super intelligent Martians and experimented on scientifically and stuff. And his way around that is to pretend to be the pet so that he can get privileges from the Martians, like some kind of understanding. Like he pretends to be herding the humans towards the Martians to help them catch humans, but he's not. It's like a ploy that he's using to kind of overthrow them. So he's trying to be smarter as a human, knowing that the Martians themselves are incredibly smart and ruthless and physically tactical. So another thing that Baxter does in this book that's sort of annoying is he's got the alternate universe, but because he's brought it more into the future, into the like 1900s and 1920s, like here he mentions Charlie Chaplin has done a character in one of his comedy sketch films that is about the artilleryman. And I think later in the book they mention other people like Albert Einstein, and they mention like popular figures from real life from the time, and then they try and like Lego piece them onto the War of the Worlds story, which again doesn't really work for me. It's like, if you're in an alternate universe, then you can come up with your own celebrities of the time. You don't have to like bolt on. Like they mentioned the Schlieffen Plan. Like Schlieffen, I think that's based on a World War One figure. They're taking people from history, and then they're like famous people, and then trying to bolt them into the story. And yeah, I don't really appreciate that. I think they should make their own characters. There's a bit of fucking feminism here as well, where like Miss Elphinstone is like complaining in her mind about how the artilleryman's like looking at her dress sense, and then later on she's like, oh, I hate how the journalist described me in his memoirs. She quotes the actual War of the Worlds, where it goes, for the second time that day this girl proved her quality, and she's like, girl. She's getting fucking triggered and stuff. And yeah, she's calling him an unreliable narrator and things. Like, they're injecting kind of bullshit victimology into the main character, no less. You know, they're trying to have her be a strong female character, but they're already failing. So they're starting to make their main character annoying right at the start of the book, which is never good. So yeah, never really had that from the journalist in War of the Worlds as the main narrator character. It was just, he was describing what he saw. It was a bit annoying in the Time Machine. I think the main character in the Time Machine injected a bit of his own thoughts. He was talking about communism when he saw the gardens and things. There are a few characters in H.G. Wells stories that are flawed like that. But yeah, this is a bad flaw to have because it's actually relating to modern social justice politics, and you should never do that in your media because it's get woke, go broke territory. You know, people are gonna drop this shit, and I was getting pissed off whenever I read a line like that in here. Just in the same way as people aren't going to like Marvel films and people are hating the Rings of Power and all these modern shows that are just kind of injecting bad politics into their show instead of writing a good story. So that's what you should always do, is write a good story. If you're trying to reach a broad audience and you're trying to make money and you're trying to write a good story that appeals to everyone, then you don't let your politics get too deep, I think. So in this chapter 2 is the first mention of the Schlieffen War, which is this book's version of World War One. It's not World War One, but in World War One there was a thing called the Schlieffen Plan, and it's an alternate universe thing based upon that. So there is a war in this book between surprising factions that goes a completely different way from World War One, but takes place in the same period that World War One took place. So it's like a different war standing in that era, 1914 to 1918, I believe. And it turned out differently because it's in the steampunk way. They had the Martian technology from the first Martian invasion, and they used that in their different World War One. So the factions are different, the outcomes were different. So at the moment it's saying, from what I can work out, that the Germans were fighting the Russians in the east, and they were using Martian weaponry to create little super weapons and things. And the Americans stayed out of it, and the French were defeated early on. The British had advisors on the side of the Germans against the Russians. I think that's how they're doing it at the moment. I think they go into more detail later. The good thing about that, though, if it's the way this war goes in this book, is that the Bolsheviks would have been, you know, I don't know if the Germans teamed up with the British and went to war with the Russians at that time period, but if so, the Bolsheviks would have been wiped out during the early stages of the rise of communism in that time. I know it's saying that there were possible British advisors on the side of the Germans in this war, but it says Eric went on, and Eric's the British guy, Major Eric Eden here. He said we did well to stay out of that. So he's talking about the British having stayed out of that war? That doesn't sound right. I'm assuming the Americans stayed out of it anyway, but I'm not sure. I'll have to work it out. They've also come up with a condition. Miss Elphinstone phones, or is put through via submarine cable to like a specialist doctor who's treating the journalist Walter, and she says he has neurasthenia, which is a made-up condition. They're saying the privates who faced the Martians called it heat stroke, or the hots, or the sweats. So there's a condition from people who survived the first Martian war, basically, which I guess could be something to do with getting too close to the heat ray. And because it leads into the next chapter, I'll go into that. Chapter 4. An unreliable narrator. Again, I don't think they should be calling him the unreliable narrator. Right, so yeah, they begin this chapter still mentioning the heat stroke, neurasthenia, I think it's called. And then they also mentioned that the Schlieffen War is currently ongoing. It's still going on during the events of this book, so that's kind of cool how I guess the Martian invasion actually intervenes in this version of World War One, which uses stolen Martian weaponry to fight the war. Yeah, and so they're trying to explain the heat stroke, neurasthenia, the hots, the sweats, in terms of describing shell shock as being the the psychological effects in World War One of being in an artillery barrage, but since they can't refer to World War One because they've removed World War One from this alternate universe, they're referring to the Boer War and the war between the states to get their basis for describing shell shock, so that they can explain heat stroke. They've kind of he's kind of dug himself into a hole with that one. So the journalist had burn scars apparently on his hands. We know that the journalist dived into scalding hot water to avoid the Martians at the first time that they properly attacked a town that he was in with the artilleryman. He dived into the boiling water to escape and then had to pull himself out of it. Yeah, so it's kind of like the psychological, not craziness, but the psychological post-war fear of an artillery barrage, which is shell shock, but transplanted onto like heat rays. So the journalist's doctor for his heat stroke condition, which, thinking about it, heat stroke is something actually in the real world, which is completely different, is called Charles Samuel Myers, I believe. And he seems to be more of a like psychological therapist than an actual like treating physical ailments doctor. And he's doing this annoying thing where he's like taking apart. He's talking to the journalist. What they called the journalist here again? Walter Jenkins. He's talking to the journalist to him, as if he's doing a psychological counselling thing, and he's trying to piece apart his personality and tell him that he had psychological problems before the Martian War that are the source of all his problems. And the journalist's like, no, I don't accept that. And this guy's like, oh, but you are, yes. And then he starts bringing up quotes from the War of the Worlds and stuff, going, look, you were flawed before the Martians even arrived. It's really annoying. He's gaslighting him, I think. He's trying to make the journalist think that he's insane, sort of thing. Yeah, so his therapist, basically, this Charles Samuel Myers guy, is treating him like shit, and he's like debating him on whether he's a good person or not. He's trying to convince the journalist that he's a shit person, and he was before the Martians arrived. And he's like bringing up like how he left the pub owner of the Spotted Dog by borrowing his cart to go see his wife, and how he killed the parson, like the curate, and how he didn't remember the guy's name, which they've put in the book as Nathaniel, which is from the musical and was never mentioned in the actual War of the Worlds book. So they are referencing the musical in here, which is kind of good in a way, but how they're doing it, it's kind of annoying. I hope they're trying to paint this therapist guy as a hateable character, because they really are, making him attack the hero of the previous book. Yeah, his psychologist guy's full on having a go at him. He's got to be painted as a bad guy, surely. At one point, like, the psychologist, like, sir, our own government, in particular the military authorities, and, like, journalist butts in and goes, ha! What's the distinction under our blessed Prime Minister? It's like, kind of based. Yes, the police and military are agents of government, yes, very good. So the journalist now speaking to Miss Elphinston on the phone, and he's talking about this treatment, essentially this psychologist therapist guy who told him that he had this heat stroke condition, this neurasthenia thing. He had no choice but to accept the treatment, and he actually disagreed that he had the condition. But they forced him into the condition, and they said during this Schlieffen War, the best people who could offer treatment were the Germans, so he was sent to the Germans for this treatment. It was something called the Kaufmann regime, and they applied psychological pressure to him and inflicted pain upon him as a way of treating him. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that these are bad guys gaslighting the hero of the last book and trying to make him sound like he's insane, and basically kind of torturing him as a sick way of treatment for a condition that they say he has that he doesn't think he has. And he's meant to be in his 50s now, so he's a lot older man, post writing the War of the Worlds narrative. So they tied him into a chair and electrocuted his tongue until he'd speak to them. Oh god. He said a guy called Yeland did this to him, and she was like, how was the treatment? And the journalist is like, after a couple of sessions I chose to terminate the treatment. So he had a choice to get out of it. They forced him to take the treatment, and the treatment involved pain and strapping into a chair and electrocuting his tongue. But he had the choice to end the treatment. That's bizarre. And then after he rejects the treatment, they recommend him to Sigmund Freud. So instead of getting tortured in a chair, he talks to Sigmund Freud. And he's saying, like, Freud thinks everything has a root. Every psychological thing has a root that's sexual in nature. But, like, the journalist's like, oh, I don't know about that, because the Martians are completely unsexual, even how they reproduce, which they kind of... If you read how the Martians reproduce in War of the Worlds, they kind of bud their babies off themselves, like a baby grows on their back or something, and then it pops off. It's like a completely different method of reproduction, so there's no sex involved. And the journalist seems pretty firm that the root of his psychological trauma is the Martians coming into his world and fucking everything up. So there's meant to be an evil prime minister, like an authoritarian prime minister who's come to Britain in 1911 in this, called Marvin, in the UK. Yeah, he seems like he's got a lot of military agents working for him, like it's more militaristic than it was previously. Although they never talked about who the Prime Minister was or what the politics were in War of the Worlds, so it's kind of hard to compare with how it was before. And he mentions Frank as his brother. I can't remember if they called his brother Frank in War of the Worlds. They might have done, but his brother's Frank. And Caroline, he's mentioned, is his wife, which shortens to Carrie, so I think it's a good way of calling her Carrie. And he ends the chapter, the journalist on the phone to Miss Elphinstone, saying cryptically that he just wants to gather all his family together and have them on the phone too, not just her. So he wants Frank and he wants Caroline. He wants them all together in one place so he can phone them again and they're all there. And she's like, what's going on? And he's like, I have grave news from the sky. So he thinks that a second Martian invasion is going to happen, and he wants everyone gathered in London or Woking so he can phone his loved ones and I guess tell them to get the hell out of Dodge. We're taking a look at Chapter 5, My Return to England. So, beginning of this chapter, the journalist has funded Miss Elphinstone, Eric Eden, Major Eric Eden, and Albert Cook, the artilleryman, to take a steamer to him in England on the Lusitania, which is, in the real universe, it's the ship that sank that brought the Americans into World War I. But in this, I think it's just gonna make a safe journey in this alternate universe. You hear a little bit about England, and apparently they have like German soldiers guarding Buckingham Palace. So the new authoritarian Prime Minister, due to the Schlieffen War, is in league with the Germans, because there was hints that he was providing advisors to them on their side of the war. They've also done a retroactive addition again to the First War of the Worlds. I hate that he keeps doing these, it's really annoying, but you didn't really hear about what was going on in continental Europe during the first Martian invasion. And they're saying that during the first Martian invasion, the Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany was sending his German troops out over Europe, basically conquering Europe. There's a line saying the first Martian invasion didn't stop the Kaiser doing that. And the other journalist, who's her friend, Harry Kane, decide not to go with them to England, even though he's offered payment to travel by the journalist. Instead, he stays in America. I think they're leaving characters behind in certain countries so they can give a world perspective of what's going on. So again, he's Stephen Baxter's retroactively changing the names of characters and stuff and applying names to characters. So he's called well, George was there. So Miss Elphinstone appeared in War of the Worlds, and she was the weak one of the two women. I discussed that, and the strong one was the other one, who I think was unnamed. Now he's swapped those two roles, and Miss Elphinstone's the strong one, and he's named the other one Alice, but still kept the husband's name George. That's Stanmore, who's a surgeon. I think that was brought up. It's saying it'll take them 6 days to cross the Atlantic Ocean in the Lusitania, and that there are no transatlantic zeppelins, which is surprising. The Lusitania is taking them to the port of Southampton. There's some black and brown shirted soldiers that do a search on the ship when they arrive, and they meet a guy called Philip Paris, who is meant to be the journalist's cousin. And Philip's plan is to drive them out to London because there's a lot of hotels there, and then they're going to gather Walter's family in Woking, or the journalist's family, to hear his message, which is presumably about the Martians returning to Earth. There's more details here about the Prime Minister Marvin in the UK being pally with the Kaiser, and that's why there's a lot of German troops in England. They got a kind of police state thing going on in England, like lots of troops on the street checking people out. So before they set off on the journey, the artilleryman spies a Bentley car, and Philip says, "It's made out of Martian aluminium." So they talk about something called the Surrey Corridor, where there's security gates, and apparently you need passports and things to... It's very strict in England. You need passports and papers, please, to get your way around the interior of England. At Portsmouth they stop off and have a view of the port. The artilleryman's looking out over it with Eric Eden, and it says they're both military men, and they think something's... they think the military are preparing for something. Philip has the idea in his head that the Kaiser is getting bored after taking most of Europe and going to war with Russia. I suppose he's winning against Russia, I'm not entirely sure, but he's teamed up with Britain, and the Kaiser, Philip thinks, is getting ready for a war against America, because there are tensions between Britain and Germany with America, who has stayed out of this version of World War I in this alternate universe. So in this version of events, one of the things that makes Britain great, its navy, they said after the Martian War that the British Navy, except for Thunderchild, did a terrible job at fighting off the Martians. So they've had huge spending cuts in the British Navy, and all the money's gone on the land forces. And at the same time, Britain signed a non-aggression pact with the Kaiser, and part of that pact was reducing, well, I mean, they haven't had a need for a navy arms race, so there's been no technological development on the navy. The navy is very similar to how it was in the first Martian War with Thunderchild. So the ships are very similar, and there's not enough of them because they think there's no real point in guarding the seas as much in this kind of state of affairs. And they're saying that also due to that non-arms race and that peace pact with Germany, it screwed over who were at the time allies with Britain, France and Belgium, who, you know, Britain had to ally with Germany, and so Germany invaded and conquered France and Belgium with, it says, a mechanised war. And the Americans were kind of against this. They were against Britain not stepping in to help the French and Belgians. And the artilleryman's like sort of admiring the Kaiser in a way, but he says, well, if there's going to be a war between Germany and America, the German Empire in this one being a lot bigger. Perhaps the Martians will come along and put a stop to it and come between them. And then they drive to Petersfield and the Surrey corridor.
Give me a handful of men.